Alright everyone, we start off today debunking the meme. We're going to do some debunking here that the anti-gunners are always talking about, which is you don't need a firearm, just call the police. And it's sort of like, you know, don't own a fire extinguisher, just call the fire department. And the old debunking of the meme is basically, well, when danger is there now, police are 10 minutes away, and, you know, your 1911, it responds a lot faster. Your Glock 42 or whatever you happen to have, it's more reliable because bullets are a lot faster than squad cars because they're too busy jacking off by the side of the highway to respond anyway half the time. In some parts of the country, San Francisco, cops won't even respond for most forms of crime anymore unless there is literally a mass murder going on. They couldn't care less. The city governments tell them just to take a hands-off approach, and they'll arrive after the crime's done, and they'll take some notes, and maybe they'll prosecute the person who just robbed your home at gunpoint. Anyway, now we've got a new thing that we can talk about in response to rebutting the claim that we should just rely upon the blue. And it's funny, because the same people who are telling you to just rely upon the cops also say, well, all cops are bastards, they're racist, they're piggish, they're evil and insane, and they enforce the man's mandates, and that last part is at least half true. But with the Uvalde shooting in Texas, what we saw is that cops were on the scene for the better part of an hour and didn't intervene except to prevent parents from going into the school in order to try to save their children. Imagine being a parent, by the way, in that situation. You can literally hear the gunshots and screams going off 100 yards away while the cops are telling you you're not allowed to do anything about it, and they're not doing anything about it either. They're not in the building, they're not responding, they're waiting for a militarized SWAT team to show up because there's an active shooter. Well, I mean, my soft body armor won't stop rifle rounds, I might get shot. Meanwhile, little kids are being shot. By the way, every single officer involved here should be fired and blacklisted from ever serving a fucking gun. Just to be clear, those parents should sue the police force, they should sue the city government, and get theirs, because there's definitely a lawsuit fucking waiting there. Now, link in the description, archived of course. You can look at the sad state of affairs where the cops were more busy detaining a bunch of parents than actually going in and doing their fucking job. I realize there's been a SCOTUS decision confirming the fact that the police don't actually have any legal obligation to protect you, and basically they're just there to do law enforcement. What does that entail? Enforce laws. Well, it's against the law for these parents to enter this school at this time, so we're just going to let 19 kids get shot and slaughtered. Here's a proposal. Number one, for the United States. We should abolish the non-elected police officer entirely. They should not exist. There should be no such thing as a metro force. There should only be sheriffs. Sheriff's departments, by the way, much, much better. They're elected officials, they're serving in the region in which they're elected, and therefore they are more accountable to the community. Sheriff's offices across the United States have repeatedly stood up and done their job. They're much more heroic, much more likely to actually help you because you're their neighbors. The sheriff lives 2 blocks away. Well, they recognize Jim over here, and they realize Jim is a constituent, number one, a neighbor, number two. They don't want to be run out of town on a rail or lose their job, and so they do a better job. Metro forces, meanwhile, are notorious for sheltering cops that are involved in corruption, you know, asset forfeiture, which is the most unconstitutional and depraved thing under the sun. Civil asset forfeiture, you've got the misuse of their power to, you know, exploit people. You know, human trafficking victim shows up and they rape the human trafficking victim and say, well, I'm a cop, so you better shut up about this assault. This happens over and over. Drugs go missing from lockup, etc. Abolish them entirely. If the taxpayers are going to fund a protection service, which is what the police should be seen as being, not just enforce the law, but actually do a meaningful job that the average person would want, let them be elected. Let them come from the communities they police. This is, by the way, a liberal talking point. Whenever you have an instance of police brutality, what happens? Well, these cops that were brutalizing these protesters, they're from 50 miles away. They're not even from the same community. I agree with you. For once, the leftoids actually have a meaningful and relevant point. They're not from the community, so why the fuck are they policing it? And city governments tend to be so corrupt. Do we really trust them to manage police forces? This is small town America, just to be clear. There's usually less corruption in a small town than in New York City or something like that. There's a little bit less. It's a little bit better. And they still aren't willing to do their job. But if you're a sheriff, if you're elected to the position, you are compelled to do your job. If the sheriff runs in and stops the gunman, they get reelected, that's for sure. Their community loves them, that's for sure. They saved a bunch of kids. The Metro forces don't care. Abolish them all and get rid of the concept of non-elected law enforcement, with the exception of stadies who have to go on the interstates and shit and do traffic tickets. That's fine. Let the stadies have their fun. A second proposal here. This instance would not have happened the way that it happened in Uvalde if there had been armed teachers in the school, if the concept of a gun-free zone had been abolished and there were people that were firing back, even if it was only out of a self-preservation stance. Imagine you're a teacher. You're in a state where you're allowed or even compelled to carry a firearm. I think the latter should be the case. They should be forced to take gun training. They're effectively quasi-government officials. They're taxpayer funded. We have the right as a community to make sure that they have proper training. And part of that is psychological training too. You'd have to fire half the teachers in the country. We can get better ones, don't worry. Most of them are dross anyway. They're certainly not teaching kids anything meaningful these days in public schools. Make sure they have weapons. Gunman comes in. The teacher, what are they going to do? Even if they don't give a shit about the kids, they're like, fuck the kids. I hate half of them anyway because all they do is they poop their pants and they're making out in the back seat and shooting spitballs at me. That's fine. The teacher still wants to live. So when the gunman bursts in, they'll open fire. The cops, meanwhile, apparently they're going to take an hour to get involved in the situation. I absolutely believe that we should have more guns in society. That would stop these problems. Abolish gun-free zones, get rid of the very concept of non-elected law enforcement that isn't stadies, effectively. You could even have collective armories with the heavier stuff that are under lock and key and that are dispensed in time of emergency. You know, the active shooter, natural disaster, wartime, whatever it happens to be. Community armories. This should already be a thing. I think communities should start seeding for metropolitan areas and form their own semi-privatized communities, and they should fund it them fucking selves. It's not going to cost any more in terms of cash than the taxes already are anyway. Everyone should be armed at all times. Who's going to pull out a gun and start shooting? Only a completely depraved psychopath at that point would dare to do so, because they know that they'll get shot and killed. So they have to be not only homicidal, but suicidal, because they know that they'll die. Why do you think that these things rarely happen in rural areas? Because everyone has a fucking shotgun. You go to the middle of nowhere, redneck Hickville fucking Moonshine, Vermont, which is literally where I was raised as a kid before we moved to the slightly more urban Rutland. Yeah, the Vegas experience. I'd be a little bit different if I had been raised there as a small child, let's put it that way. You go out there into the hinterlands, people still have guns on the backs of their trucks, which they drive around, and they'll park it. Their gun's clearly visible, a $500 hunting rifle right in the back there. They don't worry about anybody trying to steal it, because all of their neighbors and friends are around. They've all got their rifles and revolvers and shit. You're next to your fucking log cabin. If some crip shows up and tries to bust out the window and grab the gun, they're gonna get shot. It's wonderful. It actually works. Cities, I know, are a blight. And people in cities tend to be more violent and deranged because they're constantly experiencing pheromonal overload. That's at least my particular scientific theory about why cities fucking suck. But we don't need metro police anyway. It's not necessary. Just have them be elected officials. New York City can have thousands of sheriffs instead of thousands of NYPD. They'd do a better job. Brutality incident. Well, then they get voted out of office. They can't police anywhere but their own constituency, their own borough, their own county, whatever it happens to be. The sheriff's offices in the United States, by the way, have come out against gun control by and large. Some of them have even gone so far as to say that they won't help to enforce any form of gun control. Sometimes even state level, not even just federal. And they get reelected for a reason. Because people want to be safe. They don't just want law enforcement. They want, hey, fucking protect me. I'm paying you and giving you body armor and heavy weapons and all of these things. Why aren't you doing your job? The shooting in Uvalde effectively proves that relying upon the police is a terrible idea. You have to rely upon yourself and your community. And that's really the other crux of the problem, is that communities in the United States steadily are eroding. People don't trust each other as much. There's not as much of an in-group feel within counties, within cities or boroughs, districts, and so forth. People don't know their neighbors. They have to lock their doors triple at night and so forth. That's also a problem. You don't see this quite so much among ethnically homogeneous communities in inner cities, and you certainly don't see it as much in rural areas. In rural areas, by necessity, the nearest phone is 5 miles away and old Margaret owns it. Well, I guess I better get good with old Margaret, bring her some apples from my orchard, because otherwise I can't use the phone. I realize that's now an outdated stereotype, but there are benefits to having that sort of community approach, certainly in rural America. Why don't we look at what actually works, gun control doesn't, and look and do it? Sheriff's offices are better than metro forces. Well, then fuck the metro forces. They cost more anyway. Just have sheriffs. Give everyone guns. Make sure that every even non-violent felon should own firearms. I don't believe in stripping them of their Second Amendment rights either. The only people who should be prevented from owning guns, people who are currently in prison or in an asylum. They're untreatably mentally ill, and specifically with a violent, and not depression or something like that, or schizophrenia. Inverse correlation with violent crime, by the way. Most people don't know that. Those people currently incarcerated, currently in the nut ward, or people who are potentially violent lunatics, as to be determined by a constitutional rigor. The founders understood what that meant, by the way. Doesn't mean somebody with ADHD. Other than that, everyone else should have guns. And by the way, I don't believe in raising the age to purchase a firearm. I think it should be lowered. I think that there should be no particular age range. There shouldn't even be a fucking background check, because obviously they're not working. That's about all. Peace out.